So welcome back. Now we're going to talk about adoption, starting with these different types of adoption. So adoption is really, as I'm defining it and really conceptualizing it, is both a legal process as well as social and emotional process. And so there's several different types of adoption that we see in the United States. One is completely independent of private adoption. One prominent example of this might be a step-parent adoption. So that's a private adoption, it's just through an attorney, and that's one type of adoption. You also see, and what we've been talking a lot about here, and folks are focused on for their projects, might be agency adoption. And so this is often a public adoption through the foster care system. These can be open or semi-open. Most states now really, through the adoptions through the foster care system, most are open or semi-open, meaning that the biological parents may have some ongoing contact or information about the child, even after adoption. So you have an agency adoption through foster care. You may also have an agency adoption that's private. So there's that may not, children may come out of the foster care system or may not. You also have international adoptions. And so those are often also through an agency, and we'll talk more specifically about each of these. And then customary adoption is as it relates to the Indian Child Welfare Act. So these are different types of adoptions. So you have both domestic adoption and inter-country adoption. And you see here listed, so you have a public agency adoption through foster care, a licensed private agency adoption, independent adoption that just goes through the court, and then a facilitated unlicensed agency adoption. So there's several different types of adoption that are domestic adoption. So that means children are from the United States, are U.S. citizens, and those are the different types. You also have inter-country adoption, so children that are adopted from other countries. And here, I'm just making the distinction that some children are adopted from Hague Convention countries that have adopted the Hague Convention, as well as adoptions through non-Hague countries. And so I just wanted to make that distinction as well. So to get a sense of adoption, it's actually quite difficult to get exact numbers about adoption. There's not, like in child welfare, kids that are in foster care, there's a national data recording system. So we have some data on children that were adopted from foster care, but there's not one housing, place, a database that includes all of these different types of adoption that we just mentioned. So the estimates that have looked at this estimate that there's 5 million adopted persons in the United States. We do have data for children and youth that were adopted from the public child welfare system, so from foster care. We do have data on those children. So to give an example, 2010, 53,000 children were adopted from foster care. A little over half were adopted by their foster parents, so that might be kin or non-kin, as we've talked about in previous weeks. 30% were adopted by other relatives, so they were not their current foster parent, but they were adopted by another relative. And then 16% were adopted by other non-relatives, so they perhaps were in some type of out-of-home placement, but then a non-relative adoptive parent stepped up to adopt that child. So the census data, again from 2010, shows that 2.1 million children were adopted, 1.6 that were currently under the age of 18. We also have data on, again, children from the foster care system. So 100,000 children are currently waiting to be adopted. That means that they've been freed, so their parental rights have been terminated through the Public Child Welfare Agency, and they're waiting to be adopted. Between 1990 and 2006, 247,000 children were adopted internationally. The total estimates of children that are adopted each year, again, this is an estimate, ranges somewhere between 118 to 127,000 children. I'm going to talk a little more about, so this gives you some indication from 2001 to 2011, and this is actually recent data has continued this downward trend. There have been, starting in the 1950s, there's been ups and downs in the number of children adopted internationally, but we are, especially since about 2004 or 5, we've seen a steady decline in the number of children adopted from international countries. And that does relate to both the sending countries as well as the receiving countries. And we'll talk about that a little bit more. So domestic policies that impact domestic adoption. We're going to talk about each of these just briefly, many of which we've already talked about before. So ASPA again. This requires that a termination of parental rights, so a TPR, be filed under certain conditions. So 18 of the 22 months the child's been in out-of-home placement, and parents have not met have not met the conditions in order to reunify with their child. There may also be specific behaviors of the parent that are, egregious, extreme cases in the death of a child, for example, where a TPR may also be filed. A TPR occurs before, so this must occur before a child can be freed for adoption. So either parental rights are terminated or the parent is giving consent for their child to be adopted. That has to happen first, and then the child can be freed and then legally adopted. Under ICWA, there's slightly higher standard. So a termination of parental rights in an ICWA case can only occur if there's evidence beyond a reasonable doubt that the child is likely to experience serious emotional or physical damage if the parental rights are not terminated. And they have to demonstrate that active efforts have been made to provide the services needed, so that services were offered, they were accessible, that they made active efforts to prevent the breakup of the family. And so there is a higher level of standard for those cases. So what is the adoption process? So again, we have public adoptions and private adoptions. Public, children coming from the foster care. Private are nonprofits that are licensed by the state. In either of those cases, the agency facilitates the process. And so, for example, there are many agencies now that have resource families where a foster parent goes through the process, the licensing process to become a foster parent, but also wants to be potentially an adoptive home. And so, some of these processes now are combined and consolidated in some of these agencies. But it is a similar process. So there's an application, an extensive home study process, pre-adoptive training. And so again, many of the similar things that we saw for foster parent licensing. There's also a process of matching a child to an adoptive parent. So again, these are really for cases where it's not where they're being adopted from their current foster home, where hopefully all of this has already been done. But if the foster parent is not able or willing to adopt a child, then, or it's a private adoption, these other aspects where you're going through an assessment of the child, you're assessing the child's needs, you're preparing the child for permanence, you're assessing what the adoptive parent can provide. So again, if you're moving a child, they're not being adopted by their current foster parent, that all of this will be done, as well as really preparing the child for permanence emotionally, but then also planning pre-placement visits between the child and the potential adoptive placement. And this might be, just meeting initially, but there might be even pre-adoptive placements where you're temporarily placing a child with a home that you plan and hope to be pre-adoptive. And so while that child is in the pre-adoptive home, they're still under the agency supervision. The licensing agency is still monitoring the home, making sure, meeting with the child and the adoptive parent in the pre-adoptive stage. There's also, for all children in the foster care system that would be eligible for adoption subsidies. These are subsidies to help the parents provide for the care of the child. There may also be additional medical subsidies or reimbursement for some expenses. And so many children coming from the foster care system would be eligible for these adoption subsidies up to the age of 18. So adopted parents, this is especially important so that there was a disincentive for foster parents to adopt if they were going to stop receiving any support whatsoever, financial support. So this is an incentive for those foster parents to adopt a child. They're still going to be receiving the financial support needed. So adoptive parents also, once all that's been done, pre-placement, you still must finalize the adoption in court. So the adoptive parents would hire an attorney, submit the adoption petition, you go in front of a family court judge, and that is, the adoption is finalized. There are some post-adoption services as well, which is critically important, and we're going to talk about that in a minute. So let me talk just a couple specific things. So adoption subsidies, these began in 1980, and then these were increased with ASPA in 1997. Again, the goal of these was really to incentivize parents to adopt. So 89% of adoptions receive some type of subsidy. And this is usually up until the age of either 18, many go all the way up until age 21, if they're in a state that's extended up until the age of 21. And so they receive monthly payments as they would in foster care. They receive a monthly check for the child. What qualifies a child for an adoption subsidy? This is the language that's used. So a child is determined to be handicapped, and I've listed here, this would include physical, mental, emotional condition that is so severe it would create a significant obstacle to adoption. And so you can see the list, and there's a link online, a list of qualifying conditions in New York, for example, that OCFS sets. So that's one criteria. The other criteria that could be met is that the child is considered hard to place. And this is where we see that number rise dramatically, so the 89%. For a child to be considered hard to place, that includes child's age. And so currently that's 9 or older is considered hard to place. They are in a sibling, so having a sibling group because there is much efforts to keep siblings together. So if they're in a sibling group, all of those siblings are harder to place. And if they've been in care longer, they're also considered harder to place. So many children that are being adopted from the foster care system meet one of these criteria. And so that is how they're eligible for the adoption subsidy. So Fostering Connections of 2008 is the most recent policy that's been put in place to, again, add incentives for adoption. One is the delinking. So AFDC eligibility criteria means that a child, when they first came into the system, would have been eligible for AFDC. So they would have been eligible for income assistance at the time they came in. One of the ways to promote adoption is to get rid of that. So that criteria is no longer relevant. There's also adoption incentive programs. So states have incentives if they increase the rates of adoption. So states are incentivized to do that. And also just awareness of some of the current benefits that are already in place. So efforts, for example, to inform adoptive parents of the adoption tax credit, which is already in place. It's just an underutilized incentive. So those are some recent efforts to promote adoption even further. So customary adoption is a permanency option for cases under ICWA, and this is about, as the name suggests, it's an adoption as practiced by customs, laws, or traditions of the child's tribe. In the quote here, it's about making relatives, not breaking up families. And so honoring the traditions of the specific tribe, where you may not be wanting to change family dynamics, where you're, for example, if you're legally adopting someone, you're legally adopting your grandchild instead of legally changing that relationship from grandmother to mother. Having a customary adoption allows that person to have a permanent, legally binding caregiving relationship without having to change those dynamics. The other key piece of this is that it does not require termination of parental rights. So if I am the grandmother adopting my grandchild, that my daughter, the mother of the child, can still be involved and does not have to have her legal rights terminated. She still has some legal right and relationship. And so that's a significant piece. There's more on this link that's also on Blackboard, so you can look at that as well. And then just a little bit more about international adoption. So I mentioned the Hague Convention. It was from 1993. The U.S. did not ratify this until 2006. But this is a significant international body that tracks adoption. So it tracks receiving and sending data from the receiving countries, people receiving children to adopt, and the sending countries. They have some mandates and regulations and standards that they've set that must be in place if you're part of the Hague Convention. The child's best interest is key. So this is really focused on promoting adoption within the home country, so maintaining children within their own culture and country, so that international adoption is only allowed if that is not possible. So adoption in the home country is not possible. There has to be very clear documentation that there's no coercion of either the child or the parents in giving consent, addressing concerns and issues around potential trafficking or coercion, or even monetary incentives for giving up children for adoption, and especially for families that have very few resources. So that has to be clearly documented, and there has to be clear documentation that there's effective training and preparation of the adoptive parents. So it's setting some standards for the receiving countries that they have to make sure that the adoptive parents are prepared. International adoptions are through private agencies. This is not, Erie County DSS is not in the business of international adoptions. This is, if you see international adoptions, they're done through private nonprofits. They are similar in the process, again, of the same home study, applying to become an adoptive parent. You're going to a private agency and going through a very similar process. There are more costs. There's often international travel and travel costs, as well as legal cost in the sending country. So it is often more costly, and it may take longer. And so, there are some differences. Child Citizenship Act, I just wanted to add this. Up until then, there was really fuzzy questions about the citizenship of the child. So as of 2000, a child automatically becomes a citizen of the United States if a child has been adopted from another country. Up until then, that was not the case. So there were some adoptees where their parents never went and applied for citizenship for them, so they didn't realize that they were not a legal citizen until they were, say, 18 and went to go apply for public, for college scholarships or, financial aid. And so this law changed that. So that's significant as well. Okay, so we're just going to talk a couple more minutes now about some concerns, issues in adoption. One of the significant concerns is this issue of adoption disruptions. And so there's different words that are used. Adoption disruption refers to a disruption prior to legalization. So remember we talked about kids being placed in a pre-placement home while they're waiting for that to be finalized. If a child were to be removed from the home at that point, that's called a disruption. Dissolution is a removing of a child after they've been legally adopted. So this, if we're thinking about this from a trauma-informed perspective, this idea of achieving permanence that's no longer permanent and the potential impact that has on the child, this is a significant issue that we need to pay attention to in child welfare. However, it's difficult to assess how many disruptions are even occurring. There's a lack, again, because there's a lack of coordinated data tracking in adoption, it's difficult to know, especially when you have public, private, international adoptions. It's also much more difficult in dissolutions because you may have, after an adoption is finalized, records are often closed. So records prior to adoption, say foster care records, are delinked from the adoption records. Their name, child's name might change. It's just much more difficult to track that. However, given all that, there's still some estimates. So prior to finalization, 6 to 16% of all placements disrupt. There's some estimates and studies that show almost a quarter of all pre-adoptive placements disrupt for adolescents. So again, this idea of permanence and how we're conceptualizing that may not be very permanent. After finalization, those numbers are much lower, thankfully. So estimates are still, though, between 1 and 7%. What do we know from the research that has looked at this? Adoption by relatives or foster parents are much more likely to remain permanent versus a stranger adoption. So if you didn't know that person prior to being adopted, those are a greater risk for adoption disruption. We also know that a protective factor is to really have supportive services in place for families, both before and after adoption. Really looking at that developmental framework. Many of these disruptions happen in pre-adolescence when children are dealing with issues of identity. So if someone had adopted a child at the age of 2 or 3, it may not be until much later that some of these behaviors may arise. So preparing parents for that and making sure adoptive parents know where to get support even further along in their development. Making sure you have sufficient subsidies to really meet the needs of the children. Having adoption competent service providers, so school staff, mental health professionals that are aware of specific issues of adoption, so that as that adolescent comes into care, maybe to meet with a mental health professional, they understand issues of grief, loss, identity that are unique to adoptees. There's some emerging research too looking at transracial and international adoptions. So again, paying a specific attention to supports for children and youth through the developmental stages that focus on issue of racial identity, ethnic development, and making sure that youth are supported, and making sure that parents are supported, especially cross-nationally, transracially. Making sure parents are racially aware, that they have the skills, the language, the support that they need to support their child. So really thinking about what parents need to help give their kids those survival skills living in a racist society, that they may not have ever developed those skills, making sure that they have some support to provide those skills to their children. Okay, so there's more resources on this on the module. We're going to pause now and then finish up our final aspect of permanence, looking at older youth, and we'll pause here, and then you can go to the other links online. Great, thanks.